Hello and welcome to a pro basketball show with me, Andrew Willett. We're in the midst of WNBA coverage and excited to bring our content to you. You can catch a pro basketball show on streaming services such as YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify with live broadcasts on playback. Make sure to follow us at APBShow on social media platforms such as Twitter and Instagram, with more coming soon. Without further ado, a pro basketball show. Hello and welcome to a pro basketball show. We are getting set and ready for the WNBA season, just a few days away, and we are going to talk today in our last preview pod about a team that has a little bit of uncertainty, a lot of roster turnover, took two huge blows in the offseason, but one of the premier franchises in all of the the Seattle Storm. And to talk Storm, I am unbelievably excited to welcome to the show. He covers the WNBA and NBA for ESPN after 10 seasons, writing for the Seattle Storm, the co-host of the fabulous Pelton Cast, and he just is the king of analytics. Kevin Pelton, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to talk Storm. So first things first, I think we'll just get right into it for Seattle. As I mentioned, a lot of roster turnover, not one all-time great, but two out the door as Sue Bird calls it quits after nearly 20 seasons. Bree Stewart shipping off to New York. Only three players remain on this roster from last season's roster. Jewel Lloyd, luckily, is one of them. She gets to step up a lot, as we hope. But before stepping into last season, let's start here for Seattle. Can they stop the rain? I know Seattle likes the storm, but it has been a torrential downpour of bad news, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, sometimes from the rain in the winter comes the beautiful, lush, green scenery that we have in the city of Seattle. And I think the Storm is hoping that's going to be the case as it has the previous few times that they've been in the lottery.
All right, that's a beautiful way of putting it, Kevin. We'll start with the preview for this team by taking a step back to last season. As I mentioned, they were 22-14, tied with the Washington Mystics, but they did have that tiebreaker to get the fourth seed and home court advantage. Boy, did they use it in the playoffs, winning both games against the Mystics, taking care of them rather quickly before falling to the eventual champion in the Las Vegas Aces. Sixth in offense and third in defense. What were your takeaways from last season?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a team that came into the season with very high expectations, given the two championships in the previous three seasons where they had everybody healthy. And, they hadn't lost in the playoffs with Breanna Stewart healthy since 2017. So it had been a long period of time since that had happened, since she obviously missed the 2021 one game they played against Phoenix, was unable to come back. Compared to that, I think the bench probably did not provide the kind of help last season that they expected. The Gabby Williams move did pay off in terms of, it took her a little bit, but she got very comfortable playing that 3-and-D type of role in a supplementary ball handling role alongside the other starters to give them a little bit of a different dimension than even they'd gotten in the past from Alicia Clark and Kitty Lou Samuelson in that spot. And, then I think, they just ran up against a very good team. I think, the first round win over Washington was tremendously impressive, given, as you mentioned, those teams were even in the standings. Elena Deladon was healthy. I think the Mystics had every reason to think that they could get that game series to a game 3 back in DC, but were unable to do so. And the Storm won pretty comfortably in game 2. In the semifinals, the game 3 is going to always stand out as one of the all-time what ifs for the Storm, a game that a couple of times it looked like they had won, including a real storybook ending when Sue Bird was going to hit a 3-pointer to give them the win. Instead, they allow a score at the buzzer, lose in overtime in that one. And then game 4 just kind of ran out of gas despite an all-time performance from Breanna Stewart with 42 points.
I remember cheering for Seattle, just being a WNBA fan, wanting to see Sue Bird continue on. And yeah, that Bree Stewart performance, I remember in the first half saying she had how many? And to go on to have 42. Yeah, and it was quite the season for Seattle. I was a writer for the Mystics last summer. So I did have some uh, a part of me that was cheering for the Mystics, but yeah, happy to see Sue Bird in Seattle have the season that they had last year. Like you said, a lot of what ifs. And I guess as we head into this season, so much has changed before that. One thing staying the same is the head coach, Noelle Quinn. She's entering her third season, 38 and 24 in the regular season all time, and I believe 3 and 4 in the postseason. She's captained a really solid team the last couple of seasons, but has not been able to maybe live up to some of those expectations. Do you think that she's maybe in a better position now to coach a rebuilding team as a young coach?
I mean, it's interesting because I think she's got more of an opportunity to put her stamp on the team this season. And one of the things that they've done is pretty substantially turned over the offense compared to what it was. Something I didn't even realize covering the team, watching them every game until I started working on a story about Sue's career for her retirement that we posted immediately after her last game, was that like the offense that they had been running up through last season was basically still the offense that Jenny Busek had put in during her time as head coach. And since then have had, depending if you want to count Gary Kloppenberg's time is both an interim coach and an acting head coach in the Wubble, 3 different head coaches, and it was still the bones of that same offense. And a lot of what I think happened the last couple of seasons is, beforehand, you had a great deal of continuity. Alicia Clark had played in that offense with Sue Bird, with Brianna Stewart, with Jewel Lloyd, several of the bench players, Crystal Langhorn, players like that, dated back to the Jenny Busek era. After the 2020 title, when they really got hit hard, Sammy Whitcomb being another in free agency and lost Natasha Howard, who did not date back to the Busek era, but, had been a big part of the 3 championship teams, and lost Clark. Some of that continuity got lost, I think, and that made the offense a little less effective than it had been previously. The other thing that happened is, frankly, the Storm didn't replace those players as well as I think they, hoped they were going to do. Like Gabby Williams, like I said, did eventually step into that small forward role, but the bench and the depth that was such a big part of those 2018 and 2020 teams, I don't think was recreated the last couple of years. So to some extent, I think those expectations were a little unfair to Noelle Quinn. That was probably more, their shortcomings last year were probably more a product of the roster than they were the coaching. But this is definitely a different opportunity for her. I mean, the other thing is, Sue Bird as a coach on the floor is responsible for so much. Now you're not going to have that available, and it's much more of a learning developmental situation. We've seen that in training camp. One of the things I spoke to her about after, one of the practices I went out to early is, you're stopping play a lot more than I remember seeing last year or the year before she wasn't acting as head coach during training camp because she took over midseason from Dan Hughes. And she said, yeah, I mean, that's a product of, number one, we're all learning this offense together, and then number 2, the young players on the roster.
And you mentioned not only maybe a different offense this season, but obviously a different point guard. And we had known about Sue Bird going out. I think the largest story for the Seattle team is quite obvious, losing Sue Bird and then to lose Brianna Stewart. But in the fashion in which it happened, Sue Bird announces that she's going to stay for one last season. Bree Stewart signs that 1-year deal after meeting with New York. So, she's at least staying in Sue Bird's last season. But you also figure like, hey, maybe the chances are fairly high that she's going to go to New York. So my question for you here is, do you think Seattle could have handled this any differently, or was this pretty much the only way to go?
I mean, I think, look, if you won the championship last year, it might have been that much harder for Brianna Stewart to walk away from the organization. But, the biggest thing they needed to do was probably move to the East Coast. And that wasn't an option for the Storm. They weren't going to be close to where Brianna Stewart grew up, and, much closer geographically to where her wife, Marta Jargue's family is from in Spain. I mean, all of those elements I think were pretty key. And then just the commitment that Joe and Clara Size, the Liberty's owners, have shown to charter flights, which is such a big, factor that Brianna Stewart has talked about. All of those, I think, made it somewhat inevitable that she was going to go to New York. So, I don't know how much they ultimately could have done, but it might have been that much harder of a decision. The one thing that kind of stuck with me above everything you said was, as we talked about, Stewart had this historic performance in game 4, her final game in a Storm uniform. Team still loses at home. Like, especially then when you start seeing the additions Las Vegas made this offseason, how are you going to kind of sell her that even if you could have brought in Courtney Vandersloot as a replacement for Sue Bird, that's going to close the gap necessarily on Las Vegas?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up the first option. That's a tough ask for a team out in Seattle to go be on the East Coast, like you said. I'm kind of there with you. I think that it was kind of an inevitable move. You mentioned the winning maybe could have made a difference, but it it happened, and Seattle now down two franchise cornerstones, all-time greats in Sue Bird, Brianna Stewart. They do retain three players though, and that's Jewel Lloyd, Mercedes Russell, and Ezzy Madrigal. If you were to keep three players minus those two, those are pretty good players to hold on to as the team loses Sue Bird, Bree Stewart, Tina Charles, Brianne January, Stephanie Talbot, Epiphany Prince, Chantel Lavender, and Rashonda Gray, among many names. That's so much talent out the door, an unreal amount of talent. What at this juncture, like you lose all of that talent, what do you think Seattle kind of made the right decision in going to try and pick up a few more pieces, or where would you have gone at that juncture? A complete rebuild, or try and hold on to as much as you can?
It's interesting because of the fact that we have seen this team without Sue Bird and Brianna Stewart make the playoffs, win a playoff round against Minnesota back in 2019 with a group that was led by Jewel Lloyd, Sammy Whitcomb, Mercedes Russell was starting for that team. I think Ezzy Magbegor in kind of broad strokes fills a similar role to what Natasha Howard filled that year. It's going to be tough for her to be as effective as Howard was, winning Defensive Player of the Year and making All WNBA first team that season. So I think that was sort of the case for staying the course even after the departure of Bird and Stewart, that you've seen the ability to succeed without them and, kind of shift to a more defensive philosophy. The other argument, though, is you look long term, the draft classes that are coming into the WNBA the next 2 years, and we saw a lot of those players on display at the regionals that they held at Climate Pledge Arena, home of the Storm, in March, including Caitlin Clark. And you think this is not such a bad time to go through a rebuilding process and maybe spend a year in the lottery. It was a longer rebuilding process the previous time that resulted in the Storm drafting Jewel Lloyd and Brianna Stewart number one in back-to-back years, but some broad similarities to that, I think, in terms of taking opportunity to reset after this period where you've been in contention for a number of years.
Well, and I guess, man, you talked about kind of the draft class, and they could very well still be positioned to be up there in the next couple of drafts, given how much better the rest of the WNBA got, in my opinion, in this offseason. But it'll be interesting to see from Seattle. You mentioned the defense. I want to just take the tangent here and start right there. But you mentioned Ezzy Madrigal. She was near the top of the list in Defensive Player of the Year last year. How much different do you think this defense is for Noelle Quinn, with Ezzy leading the way? No Bree Stewart, though, obviously, and Gabby Williams as well. I do need to ask you about her too. But those are some big holes potentially if Gabby Williams did not come back either.
Yeah, Williams, I think, is going to be the difficult one to replace in terms of you look at the wing stopper position. That's going to probably be Jewel Lloyd's responsibility again, like it was in 2021 when they had Katie Lou Samuelson at that small forward spot. You're asking her to do that and to carry a heavier offensive load with the departure of Brianna Stewart and Sue Bird. That's a lot to ask of Jewel Lloyd. And I think she's capable of having a great season. Is she capable of doing both of those things? We'll see on that one. So that's going to be, I think, the biggest challenge for them defensively. On the interior, though, they should be pretty solid. You've got a lot of size with Sadie's back healthy at 6'6" in the lineup, and Ezzy Magbegor playing primarily. She'll play a lot of backup center as well, but starting as a power forward at 6'4", as someone who was leading the league in blocks for much of last season. I think she's got an excellent chance of doing that this year. That should be a pretty powerful combination in terms of protecting the paint. I think the question is going to be, how much does the Storm struggle at times with teams that really can space the floor and pull them out of the paint, because you don't necessarily have that same ability to defend one-on-one on the perimeter.
And like you mentioned, kind of an increased load on Jewel Lloyd defensively. She is going to have to do a lot more on offense. And I'm sure that's a role that she's welcoming, excited to step into as the clear-cut number one player. So Seattle goes, and as we walk through this offseason, they bring back Sammy Whitcomb. They sign Thea Nurse, who's coming off of an injury, Teresa Plaisance, as well as a couple of others to the training camp roster. And even before the draft, what did you think of this kind of free agent response to all of the talent I had just mentioned that was gone?
Yeah, so I mean, to a degree, given those two scenarios I presented earlier about like aim for 2019 or think long term, Storm kind of split the middle of it to a degree. Kia Nurse in particular and Sammy Whitcomb are players who are going to help you win now. But the one position that they didn't address is in free agency is point guard, where they've really turned that over to a young group of players. Vonnie Turner, is probably going to start at that position, and she is kind of the one veteran that they brought in. But it wasn't a long-term commitment to Mariah Jefferson. It wasn't give you up draft picks and a sign and trade from Marina Mabrey. One of those moves that I think would have helped them be more competitive now, but potentially have a cost down the road. And the other interesting thing that they did is kind of structure their contracts this offseason with an eye towards maximizing their flexibility in 2024. So Whitcomb and Nurse, I believe, both have contracts that are, flat the next 2 years as opposed to giving them a raise. And then Ezi Megbagor is the really interesting case where I believe her salary declines from 2023 to 2024. And she was in a position where, as a reserved free agent, she could only negotiate with the Storm. If they wanted to say, hey, play another year for the minimum, they had that option, and her only recourse would have not been to not play in the WNBA at all this season. Instead, they gave her pretty substantially more than the minimum this year, but less than she probably would have gotten as a restricted free agent next off season. So all that adds up to, you've kind of got this scenario. And they've also saved a lot of cap space this year because they had some of that earmarked for Gabby Williams, who it now looks like will be unable to play this year due to the prioritization rule with her French club Asvel advancing to the finals. So they've got cap space this year. They've got a lot of cap space next year. They've maintained this flexibility while also kind of not completely punting on 2023.
And it's really not bad business for this team. I was curious about Gabby Williams, a huge fan of what she brings to the name, as you mentioned, defensively, but also running a little bit of that offense as kind of a taller point forward of such. But Sammy Whitcomb, Kia Nurse, I think are great additions to what this roster can be. I'm curious, you said Turner as the starting point guard. Who do you see as being this team's starting lineup?
Yeah, I mean, they've started the same lineup in both the preseason game that they had, and then it was technically a scrimmage closed against the Sparks on Sunday, but it effectively served as a preseason game. We got a box score and everything, and they've started Yvonne Turner at point guard, Jewel Lloyd and Kia Nurse on the wings, and Ezi Megbagor and Mercedes Russell up front. That means Whitcomb coming off the bench in that kind of sixth player role, where I think she'll probably maybe spend a little time at point guard this season, but probably primarily backing up on the wing.
I think I might be a little bit higher on Whitcomb. I'm hopeful for her off the bench than this season for this team. I guess as we kind of wrap up before we get to talking all about this Seattle team, we've already touched on a lot of options. The last component, I think, is the WNBA draft of this offseason, where Jordan Horston as the first round pick for this team. What did you make of this team's draft, and how many rookies make this roster?
Yeah, I don't think they expected Horston to be out there at the 8th pick. Kind of all the projections, the mock drafts had her going a bit higher, and then Dallas surprised us a bit on draft night with their trade and taking Lou Lopez Seneschal ahead of Horston. So, I think that was an opportunity to get value. And Horston kind of fits into what this team is doing in terms of, look, there's a lot of positional interchangeability. I listed positions for everybody in the starting lineup, but one of the things in the offense this year is it's going to be more of a two-guard front and ability for multiple players to handle and create the offense. And Horston, just like Sammy Whitcomb and Kia Nurse, fits into that. And I think will probably be part of the rotation to start the season. How many players make the team? Rookies make the team? Well, the one player we didn't talk about is from last year's draft, Jade Melbourne, who they drafted in the 3rd round in 2022. And much like Ezi Megbagor when they took her in 2019, stayed in Australia an extra year. She's now coming over at age 20, a little more prepared, has been a starter in the WNBL a full season. She doesn't look like she's going to start at point guard to begin the season, but I think she's got the chance to win that job over the course of the year, and very likely will make this team given her long-term potential. And then the third rookie that I think has a chance to make it, they've cut two of their draft picks already, Maddie Williams and Jade Lovell, but the third rookie who has a chance to make it is Dulcie Fankam-Mengiadu, who was someone who they drafted in the second round as well, and has been really impressive with her rebounding and defense in training camp. I think, a bit more of a long-term project, but again, this is a team that has the chance to think that way. I suppose I'm not now counting Ivana Dojkic, who they signed from Europe and is also in the mix at point guard, is a rookie. She's not, she's in the prime of her career, so not quite the same thing, but is a WNBA first timer. And we'll see, I think there's kind of four spots for two at the end of the roster, and Dojkic and Fankam-Mengiadu both factor into that mix.
That is so many young players at that point guard spot that you keep bringing up. And you mentioned like it was a hole they weren't quite able to fill. So when I start to look at this team's offense heading into the year, you mentioned maybe a two guard where each guard could set up a little bit of offense. But what do you expect from this team's offense heading into the year, having to somehow find it without with a new floor general minus Sue Bird, who just had been running the offense in Seattle forever?
Yeah, I think it's going to be tough. I mean, this team offensively 2 years ago was terrific. Last year wasn't quite as good because of the bench in particular, but the starting five was, still capable of scoring with anyone, as we saw in that semifinal series against Vegas. And now, Jewel Lloyd probably has the highest usage rate of her career, I would expect, this season. That's likely to take a hit on her efficiency. To be effective offensively, I think they're going to have to shoot the three really well. Nurse having a bounce back season there would help. Sammy Whitcomb is going to get him up. We saw 2 years ago in New York, she nearly led the league in the threes. And so, if those two players are hot all season, I think you've got a chance to be, competitive offensively. But if not, maybe not the kind of floor spacing you would need, especially playing two bigs together, even though Mercedes Russell has been working on her threes, took one during the preseason after never having taken one in a regular season game in her career. And then Meg McGore is someone who can play on the perimeter, but I think is more effective in pick and roll, and we'll also see her in the post some this season.
And Madrigal is someone who I think the WNBA community at large, fans, analysts are really high on, especially stepping into a much more opportunistic role, minus Bruce Stewart this season. Nearly 10 points last year, 5.6 rebounds, all defensive second team as well. What do you expect to see from her this season? Where else do you want to see her grow? Excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like we said, the ability to create one-on-one is what the Storm is going to need. And that was a role that she played a little bit more playing this season with Chopron in Hungary, in Europe for the first time. And, her finishing has looked really good at times during training camp when I've had an opportunity to see her in practice. And, especially if they can generate matchups for her against smaller defenders, playing her and Mercedes Russell together, having her be a threat in the post is going to be necessary for them offensively. But I think she's got an excellent chance to be an all-star this season. I think she had a case for it last year, the way that she played in the first half, and then just wasn't able to kind of maintain that same level in the second half of the season when she came off the bench with Tina Charles moving into that starting lineup, and just didn't have the same kind of, shot creation around her that she enjoyed with the starting lineup.
And I think as we cover all of these topics for Seattle coming into the year, I think lastly here is, what tier do you see this team sitting in? Because I keep hearing, obviously, you've got the top two in New York and Las Vegas. The Mystics potentially might have a grasp on third, but then 4 through 9, 4 through 12 is what I keep hearing through all of these previews that I've been doing. Where do you see Seattle fitting into?
So, the statistical projections that I've done do suggest there's a bit more of a, tier structure in terms of Connecticut is interestingly the team that's in there with Washington in that second tier after the super teams. And then, I think it's kind of a 5 through 8, 5 through 9 group that is pretty similar to, I think, where most of the power rankings have had them. And then the three teams that lag in the projections are Indiana and the two that lost a lot this offseason, Chicago and Seattle. So, we'll see to what degree, sort of with a lot of young talent, with trying to develop players. The Sky and Storm are capable of exceeding those projections, but I think that's more or less kind of in line where with what most of the power rankings have them in kind of that bottom 3 or 4 spots in the league.
And Kevin, here is the part of the podcast where we have a little fun with some predictions, but obviously some projections heading into the year. Where do you see Seattle landing in terms of win-loss prediction?
It's tough to have a good feel for this with the 40 game schedule. Like we have a number in our head for what I would say somewhere around 15 and 25 is sort of my expectation going into the season.
All right, all right. And that obviously would not be a super successful season, but 15 wins, I believe last year was the eighth seed, like you said, 40 games instead of 36. So if they're around that range, getting closer to 500, I think that would probably be a successful season from my vantage point. Who is the MVP of this team specifically in 2023?
Well, if it's not Joel Lloyd, that's a really great sign for Eze Magbouar, I suppose.
I like it. Yeah, Jewel Lloyd, I am so hopeful for what we are going to see from her this season. I think it's going to be just super exciting to watch, but also a career year for her. So I'm with you there. Most improved player for this roster.
I mean, Ezzy probably I think she's got an excellent chance of winning the actual award in terms of, well, most of the roster is new to the league. I guess can you count like someone like Jasmine Walker is most improved or Kyla Charles if they actually carve out a role in the league, which they've got a chance to do here?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great pitch. I'm really it's open for interpretation, and I like that pitch as well. Who's the player off the bench, sixth player of the year for Seattle?
Sammy Whitcomb. There's a chance maybe depending on how things go that she ends up starting a fair bit of the time, but I think they really like her, providing that boost of energy off the bench, backing up across all 3 perimeter positions. She's going to play a lot, but I do think she's going to come off the bench and shine there much as she did for the Storm in 2020.
There you go. That's fair. I was kind of seeing her in that starting lineup, so knowing that Von Turner will be that starting point guard, at least starting out, or has been through the preseason. Sammy Whitcomb's a good pick for that. Defensive player of the year, it's got to be Ezzy, right? This is just too obvious.
Yeah, I mean, Mercedes Russell is, really valuable as a positional defender. And I think that's one thing the Storm missed a little bit last year when she was limited to 5 games by injuries. It isn't as big of a need as it really was. You look at when she started in 2019, that was actually quite helpful for them because you're defending Sylvia Fowles. Obviously, last season, tragically, Brittany Griner was not a factor. That's back to being somebody you need to defend this year. And, kind of some of those behemoth post centers, Tina Charles to a degree at that point. The league has moved away from that a little bit. So I don't know if it's as valuable as it was in 2019, but she still can help in that regard and just as an organizer defensively. But as he's the defensive player of the year on this team for sure.
So the last award, I open it up because not every team can keep rookies. Seattle, fortunately, uh, potentially to keep a few. Uh, is it Jordan Horston? Is that just probably the correct call for this award?
I mean, I think Jade Melbourne maybe has more of opportunity to play this season than Horston. We'll see how the
All right.
rotation shakes out. And I think Horston probably will be a part of it to start the season. But like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if Melbourne moves into the starting lineup by the end of the year. That's the kind of opportunity that she's got in front of her. So I would rate her the best chances of rookie of the year off this team.
Okay, I will keep my eyes open for that because I am excited for the WNBA action to get started here soon. Lastly, here we have kind of the more fun ones, the superlatives here. Who's the unsung hero of the Seattle Storm squad?
I mean, I think for this season, it's probably Yvonne Turner because people just haven't thought a lot about her in a few years since she was a big part of some of those Phoenix teams going up against the Storm, including in the 2018 semifinals. But she has really been a steady hand at the point guard spot for them, and that's interesting because I always thought of her as kind of strictly off ball, which was more the role that she played in Phoenix. But this is the way that she's played overseas. She and Esme Megbagor played together for Chopron in Hungary, and so they've brought a lot of chemistry in the pick and roll from that to Seattle.
That's enticing. Last time for the squad.
What was it?
The class clown. Who is the most funny member of Seattle?
They've got a lot of personality on this team. I would say maybe Jordan Horston, but Keeners could certainly make a claim for this as well.
I like the rookie getting involved there. That's pretty good. And lastly, the best trash talker on this team.
Feel like this team, at least in terms of the holdover players, Jewel Lloyd is not really to me a big talker from what I can tell. So I think I'm gonna have to like learn this over the course of the season.
All right, that'll be fun too. Another thing to keep our eye out for the Seattle team. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me for a pro basketball show. Do you have any last takes that you want to get out before the 2023 WNBA season?
I don't know if I do, but if I come up with anything, we've got a round table coming up in our preseason projections on ESPN.com this Friday. So hopefully I will come up with it by then.
Perfect. That was last for us here. Go find Kevin's work. He's one of the best in the business. Love what you do on both the WNBA and NBA side. So again, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into a pro basketball show. You can catch a pro basketball show on streaming services such as YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify with live broadcasts on playback. Make sure to follow us at APBShow on social media platforms such as Twitter and Instagram, with more coming soon. Until next time, I am Andrew Willett. Thank you for tuning in.